Gestalt psychology. Max Wertheimer, back in 1920s, was a German psychologist, and he proposed a set of theories about how we organize and make sense of visual stimuli, and he called it the Gestalt psychology. Gestalt is a German word for form or shape. And so when our eyes see things like shapes, textures, colors, and values, our brain interprets those objects and symbols, and that's what we understand, or how we understand it. So those shapes, textures, colors, values are interpreted into objects and symbols that we then understand. And this helps the designer understand how viewers will perceive the layouts that they see. So the whole thing here boils down to one little phrase that Mr. Wertheimer said, and he said, "The whole is greater than the sum of its parts." The whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So the Gestalt psychology really explains how our brains process the visual input by grouping objects in ways that create meaning or make sense to us. So another example that maybe you can relate better to would be a recipe. So if I take some eggs and sugar and flour and butter and I use they're the ingredients, right? So I'm using those are my ingredients, to then mix together to make cupcakes, birthday cupcakes. So the parts, the ingredients, are a random collection of ingredients, are brought together and thus have some larger, more powerful, symbolic or emotional or even social meaning. So in this case, it's a birthday. It's a happy celebration. So that's how we can interpret the Gestalt psychology. The whole, the birthday celebration, is more important than the eggs and the sugar and the flour and the butter. Okay? So when we look at the laws of Gestalt, they actually throw in a few other sort of rules. The law of equilibrium, law of reading gravity, and the figure and ground. So the Gestalt laws are the law of similarity, the law of proximity, the law of common fate, the law of closure, and the law of continuation. But first, let's talk about figure and ground. So Wertheimer also understood that our brains tend to divide perceived objects into two main categories: the figure and the ground. Figure representing the objects that we are looking at, or the positive space, and ground being the background behind the object, or the negative space. So as designers, we need to be concerned equally with both figure and ground of every layout. One exists in relation to the other, and both have an effect on how the audience will perceive a design. So when we look at these examples here, the designers have played with figure and ground, showing that depending on how the viewer looks at it is how they would interpret it. So in typography, you can do some really cool things with figure and ground, and it's how, our brains are perceiving those objects, the figure and ground. The reason we can read them is that our brain is making sense of that figure-ground relationship. Now, the next piece that we're going to look at is the law of equilibrium. So this states that really our human brain prefers simplicity. It prefers stability and cohesion. And so equilibrium, if you can define it, would mean at rest or balanced. And so, again, we as humans prefer to understand the things that we see. And we feel more balanced or more content when we can understand those things. And if we can't make sense of this new stimuli, then we feel confused, we feel anxious, we feel stressed, It's much more negative. So our brains try to make the world seem simpler and easier. And when you look at this t-shirt design, really it's a bunch of circles and rectangles in a very simple way. We make sense of that and read fun, fun, fun because our brains like to solve that, right? We like to feel at rest or balanced because we like to understand the things that we see. So that's the law of equilibrium at work. Let's go into these 5 main laws that Max Wertheimer stated. And you really will see these laws in psychology. We see them in interface design, and we see them in layout and typography. Starting with the law of similarity. So it just states that our brains group and associate objects that look similar. And we in this case would focus just on the circles, or you focus just on the triangles. And so this law tells us that objects can be similar in any visual way for our brains to group them. This one may be a little bit easier to see, the circles and the squares. So you are grouping the circles because they are similar, and you are grouping or organizing those boxes or the squares because they are similar, and you're trying to make sense of that. Here's an example. Actually, this has a couple things going. It also has proximity that we'll move on to in a moment. But for similarity, look at the type that are similar, specifically that white text. So it pops, it is brought together, and you're assuming that the white text goes together because it's similar, and you read it as presenting pianist Piper Lee to Dumas College. So we've grouped those. Our mind has made sense because of the law of similarity. Now, the law of proximity I stated is also indicated in this design. Proximity meaning how the nearness or how close things are to each other. So the law of proximity states that our brains group and associate objects that have locations near to each other. Again, it's the nearness. So proximity here, we see that there is more of a triangle on the right side because those circles seem to be close to each other, and so we're assuming that they are related, and so they go together. So with proximity, we also use this in typography, where each letter, the proximity of each letter to others determines the text, the word, and then the meaning associated. So in this first example, they've gone to get her. Proximity, bring those last 3 words closer, and we have a whole nother message saying they've gone together. Okay, so understanding proximity can help a designer avoid an unintentional association and miscommunication. So if one object is close to another, the viewer is likely to associate the two, even if it wasn't the intention of the designer. So you have to be cautious of that. So in this case, due to proximity, we see 4 different groupings, 4 different conferences because of the way that the structure states. So we see the Creative Suite Conference, the InDesign Conference, and we see Toronto, Canada. We see the Creative Suite Conference, and we see Nashville, Tennessee. All right, so part of this is we group because of how we're perceiving all of the information as well. So really that initial column, InDesign Conference, the Pixel Conference, the Vector Conference, the Conference for Acrobat, and then Miami Beach, Florida, we set sort of a mood or we acknowledge that those go together, and so then we assume that with proximity those others must go together as well. The law of common fate. This states that our brains will group and associate objects that share a common direction or orientation. So they have something in common. When you share a similar quality with somebody else, you say you have something in common. And so with our elements here in typography and design, when we talk about the law of common fate, that means that, they have something that's similar, so it's very close to the law of similarity, but it's similar in a direction or an orientation. So fate refers to, where we will be in the future. So that's the law of common fate. So in this case, we have, all of these rectangles going in one direction. Then we have one that's not. So that is different. It sets it apart. It's not the same as the others that share that law of common fate. Here we see the law of common fate in the arrows. So again, our brains try to make sense of things. So we're looking at those that share a common quality and a common direction of where they are going. So we look at the arrows that are all facing to the top left, the top right, and we group them trying to make sense of how is this working, right? So we're trying to figure them out using the law of common fate, the direction that they are going. In this case, we may help, the law of common fate may help us read this poster because we have words going in different directions. So we are able to read Carter Rohanville Zoo because it has a common fate with the direction that the text is going. Adventureland is read together. Exotic Animals Adventureland is read together. So because of common fate, we sort of group those things together. Now, the law of closure, closure meaning completion, this states that the familiar shapes are more readily perceived as complete than as incomplete. So closure is that we close things, right? We complete it. The law of closure states that we are able to perceive these two examples here as a circle and a square very easily and very quickly because we are familiar with those shapes. Again, here's an example. We see a triangle in the middle because we're familiar with that shape and it makes sense to us. Now, if we look at an example here of closure, we fill in the gaps. We tend to overlook those white bars and we see it as one whole. Our next example here, also an issue of a closure and similarity. But closure meaning that I bet you can read caution radiation area because you're using closure in the typography. You're filling in what we can't see. You see the C-A-U-T and then you kind of lose it. You see part of the R, you see the A-D-I-A-T-I-O and part of the N. And you don't see the A and the R really, but you see maybe an E and an A. So you're using closure to fill that in. You're using closure to complete it. Now, the law of continuation states that our brains will group items that seem to belong to a continuous line. And so the perfect example here is the constellations in the sky. So you're able to see the constellations in the night sky because of continuation. You're continuing and you're making that continuous line. We also see this in typography, especially in layouts where the alignment is justified. So that means equal on the left and equal on the right. And we get what we call rivers of white going through those columns, specifically if it's a narrow column. And so the law of continuation actually is letting us see those rivers of white. So when working with type, we also see this phenomena of continuation where we recognize strings of letters as words and strings of words as sentences. So if we look at an example that not only has law of continuation, but actually this is a great example that applies almost all of the Gestalt laws. So we have proximity here indicating between the tongue and the iron, that closeness there. So we're assuming they're together. And the similarity, obviously, in the overall shape of the tongue and the iron as being a triangular shape. Then we have similarity, common fate, and continuation because we see a strong vertical presence across this page from top to bottom. The tongue points to the iron, and so it continues. They have a common fate because they're going together. They end up merging with continuation. And then, of course, we can assume closure because we assume the tongue is getting burnt, and we probably can imagine what the rest of that face looks like. And so that would be a closure to complete the face of the burnt tongue. So the Gestalt laws, the Gestalt psychology developed by Max Wertheimer, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts.